Hi people, it's Archivist here, and today I'm going to be showing you World of Warcraft running on the 2020 13-inch MacBook Pro. And take note that this is the one with the 10th generation Intel processor inside, not the cheaper 8th generation model. So I wanted to show this because last year I was using the 2019 MacBook Pro and I felt that it could play World of Warcraft decently well, but you would have to sacrifice pretty much every setting and play it on low across the board. Here, to get 60 FPS most of the time, or very close to it, you can actually turn up a fair few of the settings, and I can play it at resolution that's very close to 1080p. I'll quickly show you the settings I'm using for this gameplay. And I mean, fundamentally, I want the footage to speak for itself. You can see the game running. I'll try and amplify the frame rate counter and maybe put it in the corner so it's a little bit clearer. Apologies, it might still be a bit blurry because I'm capturing it, I guess, in a very old school way, but the reason is that I don't want to run the recording on the laptop itself because that will actually impact the frame rate of the game. So I'm afraid I'm doing it in this very old school way, but bear with me on this. For the record, the easiest way to identify this laptop at the moment is quite easily, you know it's 2020 because the escape key is separate from the touch bar, and also there's a T-shaped arrow keys rather than, I guess, whatever the old style was. So I was quite impressed with this performance, but it does demand context in terms of how I say I'm impressed. The positive outlook is that this is a Mac, and therefore any game running on it well is a good thing. And this is running decently well. It's running at very close to 60 most of the time. In fact, a lot of the time it is just locked to 60, even if we go into some of the newer zones. And it's a very slimline device. It's only 13 inches. It's extremely thin as well, putting out this very formidable performance. I also am turning VSync on. Some people might ask, why am I not just getting as many frames as possible? Reason is heat, to be quite frank. If you want to play this game and you want it to not be incredibly loud due to crazy fans and also very, very hot because it's basically pushing itself to the max, the best way to do that is to simply limit the frame rate. And what better frame rate to limit to than 60, which is the maximum refresh of this screen anyway. So for me, VSync on a laptop is a very good idea in terms of just the overall experience. Though I will say, to control this, if you're wondering, the way I'm doing it is that I've got a keyboard attached to it off screen and also a mouse. So I'm playing this in a very awkward way where I'm behind the camera with a wireless mouse and a keyboard. So that's why you can't see me actually touching the keys. But it's impressive in those senses, slimline, macOS, but why is it not impressive? Well, the answer is obvious, because it's a laptop that costs $2,000, or I want to say 1,800 potentially for the slightly cheaper one, which is still 10th gen off the top of my head, and yet it can't play World of Warcraft at particularly high settings, right? And that is sometimes a little hard to justify, right? Which is why it's very crucial to take this with a grain of salt. I would never buy a Mac for gaming, as in the intention of me buying the laptop is for playing games. I would buy a Windows machine, and indeed I do have a dedicated Windows desktop that I use primarily for playing World of Warcraft. But there's no reason that we wouldn't want a device that we buy for other reasons, such as just general computing tasks, maybe some video editing or watching some films, that kind of stuff. There's no reason we wouldn't want to also use that to play games, because sometimes we do find ourselves, not so much at the moment because of the state of the world, but generally we might be traveling, maybe we're commuting, staying in a hotel, and we don't have access to our big powerful computer, and therefore we want to use what's to hand, and that might be our MacBook Pro. And it's a hell of a bonus if I can choose to play some games on that MacBook Pro, and even better if it's actually of a decent performance quality. And with this, I honestly believe that as long as you're intelligent with the settings, and feel free to mirror mine because I think they're pretty good for questing, it honestly is quite a decent experience. The only thing that would stop me from wanting to play on this constantly is the fact that the screen is quite small and it would strain my eyes over time. And then you might say, well, okay, you can attach it to an external screen, and that's true, but then if you put these settings on a big screen, then the sacrifices do become a little bit more apparent. If you're seeing World of WarCraft with these somewhat compromised settings on a 13-inch screen, it's not too bad because it's harder to make out those imperfections on a smaller screen. It's a bit like the phenomena where people often say that Nintendo Switch games actually look better in handheld because, of course, they're crushing it onto that small screen, so the imperfections of a lower resolution aren't as obvious, which is the same here. But aside from just general performance being decent for the size and the profile, not for the price, but for the size and the profile, there are some other benefits to this particular machine. Firstly, and I was shocked with this when I was doing this test, the fans were, for the most part, silent, like not even turned on, which is incredibly impressive. I expected it to be going off like a jet engine, but it's actually pretty good. Again, I think somewhat down to the fact I'm using VSync to limit the actual power of the machine intentionally, but still very good. It did slightly turn on a little bit when I would get into combat with a lot of particle effects on the screen, but then again I do turn particle effects to be quite high, so I could have probably avoided that if I'd have turned that down. But yeah, it's generally a surprisingly quiet machine when doing this, and I was very, very surprised by that. In terms of heat, I will admit it does get quite warm, and that's been the case I think for every MacBook I've ever used. They've always got quite warm under the keys, but I think maybe it's because it's just more crushed together, but with the 13-inch Pros, I've always found them to get very warm, particularly towards the top of the keyboard. And over time, that isn't particularly comfortable to use, and also you don't really want to be like sweating all over your keys because they're getting so hot. So my recommendation, if you're playing for a reasonably long period, is to basically get a separate keyboard and mouse to play the game. And if you're considering portability, maybe try and get something like the Magic Keyboard, where it's very slim, and if you put it into a backpack, it's barely going to add any extra weight, because just the fact that you will no longer feel the heat from the laptop is a bit of a bonus. But look, don't get me wrong, it's not unbearable. It's just something to note. It absolutely does get warm when playing the game. Maybe if they'd have changed the fan profiles on the machine to make it so that the fans kicked in quicker, that may have changed, but then of course the issue then transforms into, okay, now the fans are a bit loud. But of course you can counter fans as well by turning up the speakers or putting headphones in. And here is a bonus to this laptop as well, is that the speakers for a 13-inch device are phenomenal. And when you're playing a game and say you just don't care to use headphones, maybe, again, you're in a hotel room just by yourself, there's no reason to, it's nice to be able to enjoy this game with very good audio. So having decent speakers on this is definitely a bonus. And, again, it drowns out the sound of the fans if they're quite quiet. But they are just good quality. It's not just about volume, the actual sound. Like when you're hitting enemies with your attacks, you really feel the weapon swings. So there's a nice bonus there. Another thing about the machine is the color gamut on the screen. So this is a wide P3 color gamut, which in layman's terms, everything's a bit more colorful, right? So greens are more green, reds are more red. And a lot of people like to say that the best advantage of that is that if you're a photo editor, you get more accurate colors. And yes, that is absolutely correct. That is a bonus of it. But honestly, I think you can apply that to the general user experience, whether you're watching videos or, like this, playing World of WarCraft. It just makes the game look more vibrant, especially when you turn the brightness all the way up. The colors really pop off the screen. And, you can have the most powerful machine in the world, but if the colors aren't particularly vibrant, it's not going to look as good. So that is definitely an advantage as well. The colors on the screen are great. I suppose you could say that it would be nice if the screen was 120 Hertz, but I don't think the power is in this device to really take advantage of such a panel anyway. So it would be nice, but I don't know if you'd be able to take full advantage of it. Another thing where they've changed from butterfly keyboards in the past to the more elevated keyboard, I think that is a little bit more satisfying for gaming, because it's nice to type on, but it's also nice just, to use the keys to move around in the game. And also, although I'm not demonstrating it here, the trackpad on the MacBook Pro is so good, so responsive, so, I don't know, just intuitive, that I can honestly play this game for, I'd say, about an hour quite comfortably and use the trackpad. The reason that's actually quite an important factor, because many might say, well, I would just use a mouse every time, and yes, I would use a mouse most of the time, but the reason that's quite significant is because the moment that you can play World of WarCraft just with the device itself, so just basically on your lap. That means you can start using it, say, on the couch. So say you're watching something on TV, but you can also be playing the game quite handily just having the laptop on your lap. Although I would admit maybe putting a cushion on your lap directly, because otherwise the heat of the Pro will start to warm your lap up, which isn't particularly comfortable, as you can imagine. But the ability to just take it and it's still playable with just the Mac itself, without the need necessarily for a mouse or a separate keyboard to make it playable, is definitely an advantage. I mean, yeah, it's not optimal to do it, but the fact you can do it and do it quite comfortably, I think is fantastic. So yeah, you've probably been watching the video, noticing the frame rate, and of course you've been coming to your own conclusions about how you feel about the performance of this. Crucially speaking, in a questing and exploration setting, I appreciate I'm not in this video showing any raid content. I can give you a quick answer if you're curious about this. Essentially, I find it's about 45 to 50 FPS, but I can get that a lot higher if I drop the particle settings way down, because particle effects are very demanding when there are lots of people firing off spells, as you can imagine. I'm happy to make a separate video if there's any demand for it, but I thought just for this one I wanted to crucially show what's just the general experience with this laptop. And yeah, I don't play a lot of games on Macs. There aren't a lot of games available for Mac, to be quite frank, and even with Apple Arcade I tend to find that they're better on like iPad and iPhone. But World of WarCraft, I think it's had some ups and downs on Mac. When I first got my very first MacBook Pro back in 2012, there were some very bizarre performance issues. Turn stuttering was a thing for a long time, but I think they've actually done a decent job optimizing it for the software now, the operating system, I should say. So I do commend Blizzard, considering that inevitably the macOS market is going to be tiny in comparison to the Windows OS market for this game. But yeah, this is one of the better efforts and one of the best games I think you can play on Mac, to be quite frank. Certainly, you can spend a lot of time with it. So yeah, this has been a look at the 2020 13-inch MacBook Pro 10th generation Intel processor inside. Hope this has been informative. If you've got any questions, let me know. If you want any follow-up videos to see more aspects of World of Warcraft, maybe different zones, raiding, I'd say PvP, but I'd probably embarrass myself. But feel free to ask. As always, people, thanks very much for watching and see you next time.